This is the final session of the Ensembling movement of the SIX Wayfinder, but it's also a very exciting recording live of a podcast connected to the UpSocial podcast series, celebrating their 10 years of 10th anniversary of operation. So it's great to be here doing both of these things on this sunny Friday. My name is Louise. I'm the CEO of the Social Innovation Exchange, and we're responsible for running the Wayfinder event this year. We turned our 2-day physical Wayfinder event into a 6-month musical metaphor, a movement of 4 parts, where we started by tuning in and listening to people, and then we started to bring people together again. At the moment, we're finishing our bringing together our ensembling phase with this very exciting conversation on probably one of the most important topics for all of us working in the field of social innovation: scaling. It doesn't sound too exciting as a topic itself, but it really does matter. And we're going to have a conversation today with 2 people who know a huge amount about this topic and have been working in it for a long time: Miquel de Paladella and Geraldine Cahill from Spain and Canada. So thank you both for joining in with us today. We've also got some comments from a couple of other people who have been working in this field from Austria and from France. And of course, many of you at home calling in from different places. So before we move into the podcast, let me just explain, I think social innovation for us at SIX very much is about seeing things from different perspectives. It's about turning things on its head as much as the mechanics of doing things. And so usually on the UpSocial podcast series, you would find Miquel interviewing somebody else. Miquel is holding the reins and asking the questions. At SIX, we like to be a bit different. We like to flip things on their head. And so today I will be asking the questions, and Miquel is on the other side of the room along with Geraldine. So thank you for being so relaxed about switching roles with me, Miquel. I'm not going to read out either of your bios because they're far too long, and you can have a look at them both on the website. But as a brief introduction, Miquel is the co-founder and the CEO of UpSocial, which works all over the world. We're a specialist firm focused on implementing and scaling innovative solutions to social problems. And Geraldine is the director of UpSocial in Canada, which was launched, I think, just last year. So rather than me telling you any more about the 2 of them, why don't we jump in and they can introduce themselves. And I'd love for the audience and the podcast listeners who don't know very much about what UpSocial does, for them to learn a little bit more. And in particular then to come, so we'll start with Miquel, and you can tell us about UpSocial and the work you do. And then we'll go to Geraldine, and you can tell us about how on earth there is an UpSocial office also in Canada. So thank you. Welcome to you both. So nice to talk to you. What a privilege and a pleasure. Miquel, tell us a little bit about UpSocial, please.
Thank you, Louise, and the privilege is mine. Yes, I'm used to make the questions, and I feel very uncomfortable answering yours. So, but I'll make the effort of speaking very quickly about what UpSocial is all about, because we're turning 10 this year, and this is a moment where you start looking back and said, what was it worth it? All the effort, the loss of hair, and so on. What was it worth it? And yes, what are we? So what are we? We are a social innovation lab that is obsessed with scaling proven innovations to solve critical social challenges. And we started in Barcelona, operating in a context of, we actually were born in the moment of a crisis, of an economic crisis, where austerity was the only word that matched with, or that was confronted to the word innovation. So yes, we need innovation because we don't have any more, we don't have money. We just cannot do more of the same. So we need to change that. But then when you look back and we started basically also thinking that the problems that Barcelona had were pretty common to many other cities. And also, this meant that perhaps the solutions that were designed in Barcelona could be used somewhere else. And perhaps the solutions that were designed somewhere else could be implemented in Barcelona. So I had worked in UNICEF, I had worked in Ashoka, and there were so many wonderful initiatives out there that I don't know why they remain at a local sphere. They have never, overcome the barriers of the locality where they were created. And then we started like adapting and adopting innovations here in Barcelona. And we ended up understanding that certain innovations have non-negotiables that are key to the innovations and others that can be adapted. And we started experimenting with that, and we saw amazing results happening. And this is where we started like growing and expanding internationally. Now, if we look back to what we have done, then you become a bit more critical of things that we didn't see. And this is about the importance of scaling, precisely. I mean, some of the things we have done are too small. Scaling on the basis of demand, which is what we do. So instead of us going with a solution in search of a problem, we try and understand what the problem is, what the assets exist locally, and we bring some of the best innovations for the locals to choose which ones they would like to adapt and adopt. So that's a very simple process. Now, if you think of what has changed and you see the context in which we live today, you see that there are so many systems that are in crisis. The health system is clearly in crisis everywhere. That's very clear. But the same is happening with the education system that is failing many children, or the same is happening with the governance system that we have that is forced to make unpopular decisions without information. So in a way, what I feel is that we haven't been that good at addressing how change happens in the system, so that the system that creates the problems is changed and transformed into something that is able to prevent those problems to happen again. So I'm very happy to have lived these 10 years and to seen some of the big successes we have had. Yes, we have, but also some of the big failures or the non-successes we have had in consolidating some of the changes that are really at the bottom, at the cause of the problems that we have been trying to solve. We are good at creating patches, and I hate to say that, but that's perhaps one of these hard conclusions that you come up when you look backwards.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Miquel. I think this is a very interesting conversation between the two of you, and also for SIX as well, where some of the three organizations, or we're involved in three organizations that have been around for more than 10 years. And it is a very interesting, creating patches as that example is something that none of us want to be doing. That's not why we're in this business. And Geraldine, you've been deeply immersed in the social innovation field in Canada for as long as I have in other parts of the world. And so, but how did it come to be that the UpSocial came to have an office in Canada, and what's the different kind of context there? Why is this important in the Canadian context? You guys have been talking about scaling and providing models of scaling out and scaling up and scaling deep and lots of different things for a long time. So tell us about UpSocial in Canada and kind of why now?
Sure, thanks, Louise. And I had just to explain, because we didn't go over, it's good that we didn't go over long bios, but so I was with Social Innovation Generation for the last decade, which is what you're referencing, which was this partnership of institutions in Canada that were essentially like SIX, trying to create a kind of an ecosystem for social innovations to develop and scale. And that required the kind of coordination of systems, the way that Miquel is putting it too, like how would finance and education and entrepreneurship and so on respond to help to create the conditions for these innovations to grow. And so at the end of that partnership, which we concluded at the end of 2017, of course, I needed something to do. And I had been, you know, lucky in the position with SIG to be able to track a number of approaches to, you know, ways of engaging in sort of problem solving or social lab processes, like, you know, depending on what words you want to use to describe these processes. Social lab, there was many social labs out and about, you know, Rios and Inward Forward and Taxi were all using different versions of these things, all really interesting. The reason I was attracted to UpSocial was there was a couple of elements, primarily the one that Miquel already touched on, which was, as we had seen with SIG as well, there were many social innovations that had reached a certain level of development in different parts of the world, and we were specifically looking in Canada, but which had all sorts of trouble scaling. So there were ways that we could be addressing some of these systemic challenges, but they were facing all sorts of barriers to development. And I like that Miquel had really centered on this problem of how can we sort of successfully help these social innovations to scale, but also on the other side, the engagement in, I think the way I put it anyway, is this sort of thoughtful combination of existing relationships, skills and assets in the local environment to identify and then create the conditions locally for those found innovations to be brought into the ecosystem and scale up. So it was the attention to this combination of skills and assets and resources that I was particularly taken by. And I had the great pleasure of meeting Miquel in 2017, thanks to Tim Draymond. And and so I thought, I will give it a go. And Miquel was kind enough to say, yeah, like we would love to see whether this could work within the Canadian context. You know, despite the many years of you know, of attention to ecosystem development, of course, the challenges that we face are multiple and complex. So we require a consistent attention to trying to address them. And so we will need processes like this and many others as well, working in concert to try and address these. So that's why Canada, but also why UpSocial too.
Thanks, June. Let's go back to, we'll start with Miquel, and I'd love to know if it's different in each of your contexts. So, you know, I think we all agree that paying attention to scaling is extremely important on this call. We don't need to say why it is. The world is a big mess, and we probably, you know, if things exist already, we need more of them at the moment. So we don't need to go into that. But my question is, why is this so hard? Like, why is it hard to get support for this kind of work? You know, why are people not throwing money in your directions? Maybe they are, and I'm not so aware of it, but as far as I know, you know, why are people, you know, what is the challenge we're having to convince other people that this is important? You know, where is the challenge in this? Why is this so hard? And Miquel, you know, and has that changed over the last 10 years as well? I think there's an incredible perspective you have over time on this.
The simple answer could be that we are not that good at it. We are not good at it. We do live in a context in which many of the systems that we use today were created for a society that no longer exist. No? So the education system we were talking about was created for a more homogeneous society. So it is not fit for a society that is so complex, so liquid, so diverse. The same happens with the social security system, and the pension systems were actually designed for younger societies. It is not fit for an aging society as we are today. So unless we start looking at, you know, how can we start changing the system from the inside? We have always tackled or searched for influencing power. So we've been looking at, okay, so how do the decision makers, who are the decision makers? So let's go and talk to them. And we failed at developing a system that is aside. So start demonstrating that another way of looking at the education system is actually possible. But a few people do, but they remain local. So that's why I thought UpSocial is important in the sense, or our role or our view of how do we start understanding that this innovation that seems very small, like Jump Math, no? This amazing Canadian program that allows every kid to succeed in math. So this program seems to be a very small element in the system, and it seems to be part of the system. But when we started discovering the power that math has in the self-perception of children, of themselves, or of their capacities, and on the capacity of the teachers to start discovering and tapping into the potential of every single child they have in the classroom, that was a sort of going into the depth, into the deep problems that we're facing in the education system, because there are certain values in the system that give certain potential to certain children and non-potential to others. Some children are born to do math, and other children are not born to do math. This is a sort of a strong belief in the system. If someone comes here and breaks the way in which the mental model exists around capacities of children, then the potential of the transformation of the system emerges. And this is why I think it is important to start looking at a way of addressing systemic change, not just from the influence in the power relations, but also first creating alternatives. This is the work of all these startups, these social entrepreneurs that are amazing everywhere, and Ashoka is very good at discovering them, but discovering is not enough. So how do we understand again, the non-negotiables and the negotiables, the adaptable parts and the non-adaptable parts? Start penetrating the system. And once you penetrate the system, start changing the purpose of the system. And by changing the purpose of the system, by discovering that every single child, particularly in societies where we have so few children, and every child is a treasure, I think it is crazy not to think of that the work of the system is to actually make of every single child a change maker, a person that can actually improve the environment. So you start like turning around a bit the system. So we are not feeding, the school is not made to feed our industry. It is actually made to make every single child a change maker or a force for good in the community. That's what Jump Math is somehow starting to do. So if people are not dying to fund this, to actually be part of it, it's because we haven't actually managed to present alternatives that are solid enough, that are rigorous enough, well evaluated, and that because at the same time, we haven't been able to just not only influence the top decision makers, but start changing purposes of the system. You change the purpose of the system, you suddenly unlock the system is open and wants to change, and they demand innovation at this point, and we are not that good at it.
Thanks, Miquel. Geraldine, does that resonate in the Canadian conversations you're having? And is there anything else?
Well, of course. I mean, I think the last part is particularly key. I think I think we take on a lot of responsibility for selling the purpose, like of saying we must, we need to convince others that they must get in the game here. But I mean, I think parts of the system too must take on some of that responsibility as well. I mean, I think this year too, you've seen a great reckoning across the world, where great calls for like the inequities in our systems, and the call for racial justice is ringing out across the world. It's like, this is not just us, facilitators and, great sellers of social innovation that are calling for these changes. This call is very loud, and we will need all of us to get in the game here to try and address these challenges en masse. And UpSocial, of course, is our way of doing that. It's not the only way, but I do think there is a critical, a critical gap is, what Carolyn Curtis always talks really well about, the risk of staying in this system, in these systems, is far greater, much more destructive than the risk that you take to try something that is transformative. And I think it will, it will be on all of us to try and, get out of this mindset that we can't invest those dollars in really backing some of these horses, say it's the jump maths of the world. It's like, we can't risk spending that money, but why not? And I think, I think we all, we're all great believers in this, but I think that risk appetite, we need to, really push on people to believe that there is another way. That there are transformative programs and initiatives out there that are worth the risk. So it is a belief challenge for sure. And I think Miquel touches on all of that really nicely.
And I would add one more thing also. It's the white cells, the concept of white cells that come to protect when the system is in danger, then suddenly they come to protect the system as it was. And instead of looking for white cells that could actually help you being part of the solution, being part of the change, we actually fight each other. So, we become part of the problem for them and they are part of the problem for us. Mm-hmm. And instead of looking for the insiders that would actually relate very well to the change of purpose that you're suggesting, we try and fight each other. And this is a recipe for failure. So perhaps this is also an element on how do you deal with insiders that at the beginning you could consider them white cells protecting the system. But, after looking at what Trump did in the US, then sometimes you think, oh, wait, what white cells are actually necessary. It should be difficult to change the system. So why don't we start using the insiders as a way of looking at change, obviously with a proper time horizon that we have. So another problem is that we are so locked into short-termism. There's no way that social change, we are going to do it with the microwaves. There are no microwaves out there. It's all slow food. And funding doesn't like slow food. So clients, here in Spain, yes, we like to eat in 2 hours, but one of you, Luis, do you eat in 2 hours? I mean, after 2 hours, you don't even know what to do.
I've moved on. Yeah.
And I'm Spanish on the inside, so it's fine. There is much more we can go into. I would like to just invite, or just mention two things. Firstly, the Q&A function. Thank you very much for Amalia and Pearl for already using this. But if you do have questions for Geraldine and Miquel, please pop them in the question box down here on the far right at the bottom of your Zoom, which we're probably all very familiar with now after the end of 2020. And we'll come back to those in a moment. For now, though, we do have two other guests here who have some contribution to this discussion to make. So I'd like to invite them to join Miquel and Geraldine just for a few moments. Welcome, Alexander. Welcome, Nicolas. And I'm going to go to you, Nicolas, first from Scale Changer in France. Just wonder whether you can make a short comment on the conversation so far from the perspective of the work that you do, and maybe just give us a short introduction of the work that you do before you give your comment as well. That would be great. Thank you. And remember the Q&A function, everyone.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Luis. Yeah, I'm working for Scale Changer. We are a small French company, and we're helping social entrepreneurs in France, Europe, and Africa mostly to design and implement their scaling strategy. So we're all focused on scaling. And yeah, what Miquel just said about time, what the first thing I was going to say means before I will talk on the social entrepreneur perspective, as I'm working with only social entrepreneurs, and time is key, definitely, and time is key to know yourself, to know what's working and what's not working, to know what is negotiable and what is non-negotiable in what you do and how you produce your impact. So when preparing this this small podcast, you asked me to identify 3 key ingredients in successful scaling stories. First key ingredient is take enough time to make sure you are ready, or at least you are almost ready. And being ready means know what is negotiable, what is non-negotiable. Do formalize your key processes, your key numbers, your key activities, especially when you want to transmit those activities to other partners so that they can implement it in other territories, cities, countries, and so on. That's very obvious, but still true. And I said, make sure you are almost ready, because we all know that perfection does not exist. And scaling is like walking or riding a bike. You need to learn how to do it. So try first. Try to replicate in one country. Try to have one more beneficiary, and then you'll see what's working and what's not working. And then you can start thinking of going global, or at least to accelerate really and really scale your impact.
Thank you, Nicholas. Alexander.
Yeah, hi everyone. Alex from Ashoka. I'm located in Austria. Well, Ashoka is in its 40s, right? So we are slowly moving beyond our midlife crisis. We have about 3,800 social entrepreneurs right now in the network. And in 2018, we did an all fellows survey, and 800 responded, and 90% of them said, well, my solution has been replicated by independent organizations in my own country or in another country. And that sounds quite promising, right? And it was always, I think, the promise of such an international network that it would enable the scaling of these solutions and the impact. But I think 3 or 4 years ago, we decided to take a bit of a closer look. How do these processes actually work? And we saw that 90% is high, but the challenges are immense, and not all of these replications are successful, and there are a few reasons for it, right? So I think many social entrepreneurs follow opportunities. There is some kind of interested partner, some kind of interested funder, and they go for it. And after 1 or 2 years, they end up in a difficult constellation, regarding the accountability of the partner, regarding the sustainability of the impact that is achieved, also regarding the effort they need to put into this replication to make it work. So we've seen situations where a social enterprise, the originator needs to co-fundraise, needs to help a person set up a social enterprise, so needs to do a lot of support for partners internationally. And that means that the scaling is actually limited, right? Because scaling would actually mean you achieve an exponential growth of impact without in a linear fashion, increasing your inputs and resources that you need, right? And regarding what Miguel said, I think the system change component is really important. Ashoka focuses a lot of it in recent years, even more intensively. We have our own courses on that. But it's of course a complex relation to replication and transfer or scaling, because usually social enterprises achieve system change in the country of origin, where they have their reputation, their networks, their history, actually, often a history of 10 years of advocacy to make it work. And if we then decide we bring this to another context, another country, the challenges are, of course, manifold, because you need to prepare the adopters, but even the ecosystem. And social entrepreneurs cannot rely on a kind of business agency structure where they knock on a door and get some funding, some office space, a nice market analysis. They need much more. Actually, they need to understand how a social system in a new country works. And Miquel is always so humble and saying, yeah, well, it's kind of, we don't do it good enough. And I partly agree, because we really tried to get more professional about it, and you really need to get a close look. But it's also kind of the multiple challenges that we are facing. And that's also why we think it needs an alliance of intermediaries in this area, particularly in this area. You need people on the ground, and you need people on a kind of meta level to support social entrepreneurs strategically, so that they find the right pathway. And yeah, we're happy that people like Nicolas, Miquel are collaborating with us. It's also an invitation to people who might be interested, who are listening in. I think that is the way to go, to forge an alliance of people enabling the scaling of social enterprises.
Thanks for that, Alexander. Geraldine or Miquel, do you want to comment on any of those points, or respond to them before we move to the Q&A? Miquel, go ahead.
Yes. The scaling of social enterprises. Sometimes I have found that founders are a part of the obstacle. So thinking of some Ashoka fellows, they admire a lot for what they have done, but they look for someone, they look for a Spanish clone of themselves, or for an Austrian clone of themselves. And somehow they miss the point of what this clone needs to do. It's not a clone. You actually need a totally different role. So someone that is able to innovate is a person that is able to assess risks, understand the problem, and experiment, and be able to evaluate and pivot and find new solutions. So once you have found a solution, once you have been able to document it properly in a way that it can be replicated and it could happen without you, which is a big question. How do you replicate your innovation without you driving it in a different context? It requires skills and an approach that is actually not the same. Therefore, I think one of the major challenges for social entrepreneurs is to find partners that are ready to actually utilize the codification and be able to adapt what is adaptable and find the market and exploit it. So I have seen many mistakes being done in this area, on scaling social entrepreneurship, but you guys know more than me on this. G, what do you think in Canada?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with what you've said. Naturally, I think that is a challenge. The other thing that we haven't really touched on, I don't want to go too off point, so is more about also some of the barriers that can exist locally as well. And when I mean locally, I mean so you have the social entrepreneur out there doing their thing, and say UpSocial or whoever discovers that is happening really well there in Austria, and we're thinking of adopting it in Toronto, say, for example. Some of the pushback can often be from the community itself, saying we don't want that, we don't want something from outside, we got to develop it ourselves, And I mean, I think, Miquel, you touched on some of this earlier, by saying you go where the demand is. But I do think that there is also some fostering of readiness that can be done locally as well, a sort of a recognition that, and this goes to the narrative cell as well, to say it is important that people develop their own capacities to improve the situation in their own lives, for sure. There's a lot of capacity building that can be done there, and a lot of efforts are being placed in sort of collective impact models, which I think are really awesome. But they will, I think, necessarily be insufficient, because there isn't a recognition that the scale of the challenges that people face in their everyday lives naturally intersect with systems well outside of their neighborhood. So the economic system and the education system, you'll never be able to address that just simply by fostering a great spirit of problem solving at the very local level, because you will have to interact with other parts of the system, which is what makes this, this partnership of assets and resources so necessary. So I think it's the two things working in concert. I mean, Miquel and also Alexander speak much more strongly about the social enterprise side, and I'm really interested in that other side too, which I'm sure we all are, but that to me requires just as much attention.
Thanks for bringing that up, G, because I think that is a huge part of the social innovation discussion, and where the barriers are around narrative, as you say, that we're all excited by new things, new exciting, shiny things that we can co-create together. We can all, get together in our own, community lab, etc., and come up with ideas of things. And actually, the things that you talk about a lot, Miquel, around and UpSocial promotes very much is the kind of slightly more boring side of it. It's the proven innovation, the evaluation, the understanding how things work, the kind of there's a huge amount of detail in it. You want to know that, whether it's jump math or whatever it is, that it really is making a difference to people's lives and changing how things work. And that does take, to your point, time as well, as a really different kind of energy to focus on doing that kind of that longer term evaluation. I don't know if you just want to come back on that before I go to the questions, Miquel.
There's no point in scaling something you don't know whether it works or not. And there are so many people wanting to scale things that don't even respond to a relevant problem. I mean, some people that get in love with a solution instead of getting in love with the problem and focusing on it and so on. So if you're getting in love with the problem, you are certainly going to want to experiment, evaluate, understand what makes it successful, and then scale it up. But obviously, some of these organizations that support innovators or social entrepreneurs to grow without sometimes, questioning the ideation process, whether they are responding to the right question or not, that's a bit of a problem, no? And so yes, I think it's like some of the questions that are being asked here. I mean, how do you promote change in volatile contexts? We have a lot of evidence on how behavioral change happens. And basically no one wants to change alone. And this is what happens in a number of countries where there are weak institutional structures. But people want to be one of the many who commit to change. So how do we create social norms? How do we create a level of commitment that allows you to change because you want to change, but you don't want to be the one to change? Now, there is a lot of evidence on a number of tools that actually work. In developing countries, in rich countries, it doesn't matter. They work everywhere. So I believe that unless you devote enough time to document what works and what doesn't, and get the evidence on what actually are the enabling factors that made this innovation succeed in delivering your change, being behavioral change, being systemic change, whatever, you are nowhere to go with a solution. Therefore, you better, refrain from doing other things. It sounds a bit radical, but today I'm very radical. No.
It's Friday. We welcome radical thinking on a Friday. Thank you for picking up one of those questions already, Miquel. One of the things that Amalia asked, we've talked about a lot in slightly different ways, but I wonder if there's something else, because I think it's important looking at the barriers for scaling up. And Amalia's question, Amalia had asked to be more specific. I think lots of answers have come up already on this, but she points out the kind of administrative side of this. It could be political, it could be cultural. I wonder whether you could both just kind of pick up on any points that you haven't mentioned already around barriers, because we talked a lot about what would enable, but let's just be a bit more specific on those examples of barriers, please.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I was thinking just because, you know, I'd written up a number of profiles on social innovations in the past, and, you know, so many common barriers are experienced by innovators that, you know, I'm sure everybody on this call is aware of, you know, legal barriers to development. We've seen a growth in social enterprise models over the last 20 plus years. In many parts of the world, in fact, probably most, they required regulatory change as well. Like, these things take an enormous amount of time. Like, the old business models don't fit a lot of these kinds of programs. So you need to create the conditions for new ones. And that requires sort of policy advocacy and regulatory change that a lot of people don't take into account when they're going into these things. I mean, you know, you're just trying to solve a problem. Why do I have to, you know, focus on all this stuff as well? There's also obviously all innovations face funding challenges, and I think there are barriers there. Some are more frustrating than others. I mean, once again, on a legal framework, a lot of investment capital from a classic private capital side never goes into this kind of a lot of the time non-profit investing. The investment side, on that side, there's a disconnect there, which I think is hugely problematic, but also is very real for people. And then there's philanthropic capital, which is often where people go. Granting streams aren't always aligned with the kinds of programs that are coming out. So you know, there's a lot of various barriers to overcome, you know, before you even get to the sort of cultural appetite for these kinds of changes, which is, you know, oftentimes even more vast.
Alexander or Nicholas, do you want to pick up on this and add in any additional barriers whilst we're here? I'm sure there are. Alexander, we'll get to you first.
Yeah, I can maybe respond to what you said, Luis, regarding the boring part. I think what we haven't really explored yet is this big potential that people who are interested in contributing to change in a country can become adopters of a solution that is out there, right? Right now, these people, I think, they gather around maybe thinking about founding their own social startup, etc. And this is a long journey to take, right? And only a few will really succeed with that. And, you know, working together with an established social enterprise, this can be a great learning journey for you, like kind of introduction to the world of social entrepreneurship. And the good thing is that the companies and organizations we're talking about, they're really small. So there is like, you're in direct contact often with the founder of a social enterprise. And then there's a right and the left hand, and there you start to see people in their mid-20s or early 30s, right? So actually a very exciting opportunity for young people to step into this sector without, you know, starting from scratch. Yeah, that's my comment on that.
That's great, thank you. Nicola.
Yeah, just a small comment. We say that funding was very often a barrier for scaling. I'd like to say that the boring part mentioned by Miquel can be an answer to that barrier, meaning that evaluating, assessing your model, your impact, and especially measuring all the value you are providing for stakeholders can be an answer. So you need to take that time to show that the impact you're having can be turned into real money for some stakeholders. I have just one example on that. It's a French association created by an Ashoka fellow, and they are fighting against over-indebtedness, and they're implementing preventive action to households to prevent them from falling into over-indebtedness. And they had a study done by McKinsey, I think, showing that their action with like 7,000 households helped saving more than 100 million euros for bank and insurance companies. So they took that time to do that boring job, and then they now are massively funded by those bank and insurance companies. So yeah, the boring part is key, and it sometimes can help to get some funding. Not all the time, but definitely it helps.
And I will just say that was another reason why I like the UpSocial model, is because you are able to identify programs that have worked in another context certainly, I think, enables a kind of funding conversation of investment because you can show that it's worked somewhere else, whereas oftentimes with other sort of lab models that create things from scratch, you're not sure. They can produce amazing outcomes, but you're never sure necessarily that they'll work. And so that's a selling feature of the model too, I think.
Thanks, Geraldine. I want to make sure that we have time for G and Miquel to ask each other a question to finish. So I'll give you a moment to think about that. But before we do, Pearl asked an extremely important question in the chat, and I think it's really important we have time to work through this. So the question is, how does one integrate mental health healing, especially of systemic trauma, to create this internal change? And I think this is probably some of the hardest work that we all have to do. And so I offer to Miquel or Geraldine to begin on this. How do we do this really, really challenging internal cultural stuff?
Well, I really appreciate the question, Pearl. I think that it's multiple things at once. And I think we've seen this a lot in Canada. There's been a lot of attention on intergenerational and cycles of trauma within the Indigenous community. I think the same is, the same for people of color as well. And I think there's two things that need to happen, or probably multiple things. The first is that we all as individuals take this very personally and take personal responsibility to change and to call out behavior that reinforces traumatic lived experience for people, and then also continue pressure and advocacy for those kinds of changes that are being called for by groups like Black Lives Matter and so on. So there needs to be real action. I mean, I think she's asking about integrating mental health, and I think that's there are obviously programs out there to address that. But one thing that would go a long way is to see institutional governmental change that directly impacts the lived experience of people of color, deep investment in programs and services that would see their lived experience change for the better. And I think those two things need to happen in addition to the mental health programming and attention in that regard.
And this reminds me of the work we did, Geraldine, with universities and the Carasso Foundation in Canada. They wanted to think of how universities can actually become a force for positive social change in the local community where they operate. It's called what was the name of the other program? How can I forget this?
I think it's called RECODE.
RECODE, yes, the RECODE program. So, and in the RECODE program, we basically asked the universities and colleges in Canada, we asked them about what were the major challenges they had and the major barriers they had to actually change this perception of their role. And mental health was identified as one of the top 3 elements. And so they started looking for proven solutions that had actually addressed this big pandemic that exists out there on mental health, particularly now, that is not hidden anymore, it's so visible. So there are a number of innovations. I prefer not to give you, a couple of them that were selected, but they were selected for the university context. But I think that there is a whole new wave of innovations appearing everywhere at this time as we speak, that is worth exploring, because that's the next pandemia that is so evident.
Thank you both. Okay, so now Miquel, this is your time. You do get to ask one question in this in this podcast, and it's to Geraldine. So Miquel, you can go first, and then Geraldine, you can go next.
Okay, so
my favorite.
Yes, my question would be, I mean, Geraldine, you have been working 10 years in creating an ecosystem in Canada. So what is the importance of that? Why dedicating 10 years of your life to create an ecosystem? So a sort of a facilitator, not delivering programs, not solving social issues, actually just building an ecosystem that is fluffy in a way, no? That is, so Jenna, why is it so important?
Well, this goes to the unsexy part of the work too, because it's definitely behind the scenes. We talked, Alexander, I think, touched on the intermediaries or the need for intermediaries. It's that, you know, you're sort of creating a web, like an interconnected web behind the scenes to say, if we want to solve these challenges, poverty, homelessness, you know, intergenerational cycles of violence and trauma, as Pearl pointed out, there are already barriers to creating innovations, but if we can improve the chance of success, then we need to spend as much time there as those that are working away to try and discover new ways of addressing these challenges. So we need to create that web that will support the innovations to grow, and that will take more than 10 years to do, but that's why we did it. It was, you know, all of the things, the finance flows and the education and the business development and the know-how and the networks, like you guys. The network is hugely important in that as well. So that's why we did it.
Geraldine, before you ask your question to Miquel as well, you know, yeah, we talk about it at SIX as, you know, it's the nervous system, isn't it? It's the kind of muscles, it's the blood in the body. Although, you know, if they didn't exist, then everything else wouldn't work either.
That's right.
Geraldine, go ahead. Your question for Miquel.
Well, I was going to ask another question, but then I thought, what, am I going to lose my hair? You know, I just started growing this, and now he says after 10 years you lose your hair. So this is very problematic to me. But I was going to ask him whether or not after the 10 years that he's been at this work, and even in the prior work that he was doing with Ashoka and others, you know, do you ever grow more comfortable with the uncertainty of the work that you do?
Okay, what a surprising question. I am personally, I am obsessed with social injustice. I mean, that's the driving force. And social injustice, the beautiful things that have happened is that it is becoming so visible that the outrage now, I feel the outrage is more shared than any time before. So sometimes when I started working in the 80s and the 90s, we were a group of freaks that were discussing about, you know, social welfare and human security and development and these sort of things. With the uncertainty that we live in these days, what we become certain. The few certainties we have is that unless we move towards breaking the chronified circle of social injustice, or we don't go anywhere. And I think today it is more a certainty that the world is moving in this direction, despite all the bad news that you hear, but the world has been moving in this direction for years now. So when you're obsessed with one thing and this thing becomes a bit more central in the agenda than normally it has been, it generates a feeling of satisfaction that at least you are there and you're bringing more people with you, no? So no, you're not going to lose your hair.
Thank goodness.
Thank you so much, Alex and Nicola, for joining us and bringing your perspectives into this. Geraldine and Miquel, it's an absolute joy to talk to you. The podcast, the UpSocial podcast will be out soon. Darren will pop the podcast link in the chat for us. Also, the Wayfinder, the SIX Wayfinder event, it's been so nice to collaborate with you. The Wayfinder will come to close over the next few months, over the next few days, not months, days, because we're at the end of the year, aren't we? Please do sign up to the newsletter, the Wayfinder newsletter, because over the next 7 days, we'll be offering you 7 gifts with music and art and experience that we all really need to kind of close off this very, very challenging year. Thank you for being such wonderful people to speak to and collaborate. Have a wonderful day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you all soon. Take care, everyone. Be well.